Good Thursday morning. Thank you for beginning in the Word with us today. Our text comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, beginning in verse 21. The Bible says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire. So, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." This section of text is the first of several sections in which Jesus builds upon what he has said already, that he did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. In conjunction with that, he says, unless your righteousness as kingdom people exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And so what Jesus in these sections upcoming, what he's doing is he's doing two things. One, he is rebuking the scribes and the Pharisees and their particular way of reading the text, which was a clever way to maybe in some ways obey the text, but really to ignore major portions of the law of Moses on the one hand, but two, also show how in the kingdom community we are fulfilling the law by how he is calling us to live. And we're going to see that here in this particular text about anger. And so he begins with a formula that he'll repeat several times. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder." Now, this is a quotation from Moses, "You shall not murder," one from the Ten Commandments. And it's one that everyone was familiar with, one we can all agree upon. You shall not murder. It doesn't mean to kill necessarily. It means to kill with criminal intent, to murder. And he says, whoever murders will be liable to judgment. And this seems to be a particular reading or nuance that's been added to the original command, "You shall not murder," by the way that the scribes and Pharisees had been interpreting it. And it's surely true. You shall not murder. And if you do murder, you're going to be liable to the legal system of the day. You will be liable to the judgment of one of your peers. And so that seems like a good baseline to start with. We can all agree with that. We shouldn't murder. If we do, we're going to go to court, to judgment, and be potentially held accountable. But Jesus wants us to know that he's dialing it up. He's turning it up for his kingdom people. He says, we've got to exceed that. He says, but I say to you, so this is that formula. You have heard it said, but I say to you, he says that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Now, when Jesus first used the word judgment, liable to judgment here, if you murder, you are potentially liable to judgment, he's referring to a judgment of one's peers in a legal court. But here in verse 22, Jesus is most certainly referring to the divine judgment. If you are angry with your brother, you're going to be liable to God's judgment. There's not many courts out there that's going to arrest you and haul you before the bench because you were angry at somebody and if you didn't act out on that anger. So Jesus here is referring to a divine judgment. He says, if you're angry with your brother, you're liable to divine judgment. He says, if you insult your brother, you'll be liable to the council. And in Hebrew parallelism, we should understand that these two phrases, liable to the council and liable to the judgment, relate one to another, and that this is referring to the divine counsel of God's judgment. So he says, if you're angry, some translations add without cause. That's even if some manuscripts don't add that phrase, that surely is the intent here. You're angry without cause, or you're angry in an unjust way, in an unrighteous way against your brother. If you insult your brother, and the word insult here translates a word raka. Some translations just go ahead and transliterate that into the English. You insult your brother. The word raka is something, it's an insult that means something like empty. It's a pseudo swear word. It's a very harsh thing to say. You can probably think of things in the English language that you hear people say one to another that's an insult, that you're a fool, that you're empty, that you're worthless. And Jesus says, if you insult your brother, you're liable to that divine counsel. He goes on to say, whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, this is that type of Hebrew parallelism that reveals a little bit more as we go. It's judgment, it's divine counsel, it's the hell of fire. And of course, in parallelism, we recognize that the hell of fire is just an elaboration upon the divine counsel. Jesus himself, interestingly, uses the word fool in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 17. He says, "You blind fools, for which is greater the gold of the temple that has made the gold sacred?" And he's speaking, of course, to the Pharisees. So Jesus isn't merely saying that the word fool is a swear word. You shouldn't say it, and if you do, you'll go to hell. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is referring to a certain attitude of the heart, that when we possess it, it puts us in danger before God. Jesus is not just concerned with the outward act of murder. He's telling us that God looks at the inner man. And it's the very motivation that drives a man to murder that God wants us to also correct. It's anger. It's the insulting way that we treat people with vile swearing and cursing and insults to demean them, derision. It's to insult them as a fool. And the word fool doesn't just mean in the Greek, it doesn't just mean lack of intelligence. It's also a moral term for moral bankruptcy. Jesus says, when you look at your fellow human and you just look at them as someone who's empty, or you look at them as someone who's morally wicked without recognizing our own wickedness in the process, or when we have anger at our brother for no good reason, unjustly, we are committing the very same sins in our hearts that drive people to commit murder. And Jesus says, if you want righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you can't just stop with the outside stuff. You got to point the light inward into the heart where those sins begin. Because out of the heart comes these sins. We know that Jesus emphasizes that in his teaching. So he's going to give us some examples of how this plays out. In verse 23, if you're offering your gift at the altar, you remember that your brother has something against you. Now, this is incredibly remarkable. Because we often say in our thinking that we put God first and we put everything else secondary to that. But Jesus says if you're taking care of an obligation that points heavenward, you are giving your gift at the altar, you're taking care of some act of worship, something involving God, and you remember in that process that before you perform this vertical obligation towards God, you remember that there is something wrong in a horizontal relationship with your brother. You need to stop what you're doing and go make it right. This is so remarkable that the early church even applied this to something like the Lord's Supper. There's a document in the Apostolic Fathers called the Didache, referring to the teaching of the 12 apostles. I don't believe it is authentically the teaching of the 12 apostles, but it does show us what some of the Christians in probably sometime in the 2nd century were teaching or were saying, believed about some of the practices of the early church. And in Didache chapter 14, it connects this to the practice of the Lord's Supper, that if you're partaking of the Lord's Supper and you remember that there's some offense that's unreconciled, you need to stop what you're doing and go reconcile. And Jesus is telling us God cares about our horizontal obligations with our fellow man in relation to our vertical obligations to him. It's not enough to say, I love God and it's all good. I'll love God and I'll just be really harsh and mean to all of my peers. God says, if you want to serve me and worship me, you've got to make right with your fellow man. How can we worship and love God whom we've not seen while we hate those whom we have seen? And so Jesus is giving us this example. It's a remarkable example. You're at the altar. Leave your gift there. Go and reconcile. First be reconciled to your brother. That's a remarkable thing, and that's something we can learn from every day. We can easily live our lives going from one conflict to the next. One day we're mad at someone, and maybe the next day we're mad at someone else. And we mark time by the particular fight and dispute we're involved in from day to day. And that's just no way to live. Jesus knows that's no way to live. If we're living that way, it's because we have anger. We have derision and insulting towards our fellow man. We think of ourselves as better than they are. Jesus says, don't live that way. Be reconciled. He says in verse 25, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court. Don't just say, well, I'll just show up in the court and I'll prove that I'm right and that they're wrong and I'll be vindicated. He says, if you're going to put your trust in the hands of a human judge, you very well could be handed over to the guard, put into prison, and you won't be released until you've paid the last penny. In other words, your human rulers will show you no mercy. So you don't want to put your fate in their hands. He says, before you go to court, while you're on the way, you come to terms quickly with your accuser. Don't let it fester. Boy, there are so many times that I can think back to disputes and challenges I've had that if I just dealt with it then, I didn't put it off till some future time when feelings had festered and emotions built up. You just deal with it then. You come to terms quickly, my life just would have been better. Those disputes would have been resolved. And Jesus in his wisdom is telling us we got to live that way. We can't be controlled by our anger, by our arrogance, by our condescending attitude towards our fellow man. It's easy, in the grand scheme of things, not to be a murderer. The Pharisees and scribes do that, but Jesus says you should have a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. You need to look into the inner man. You need to look at your relationships with your fellow man. Work on those. And in doing so, you'll have a righteousness that grows. You'll be an effective worker in the kingdom in this world, where surely in the world there is no forgiveness until the entire debt is paid. I hope looking at the word this morning has demonstrated to you how in our day-to-day life these teachings of Jesus are so relevant, maybe more relevant than ever. And as we have begun today in the word, I hope you live today in the word.